Welcome to the videos meant to accompany the notes for thin-walled pressure vessels. In this first video, we'll go through the assumptions that we're making for these thin-walled pressure vessels, and we'll begin the calculations for the pressure of the hoop stress. Let's now consider thin-walled pressure vessels. Now these are fairly common as far as loadings go, but they're distinct enough that it's worthwhile to think about them on their own, independently of anything else, because the loads that they experience are pretty distinct. Okay, so we're going to have two kinds of pressure vessel we'll think about: a cylindrical shaped one and a spherical shaped one. There's my spherical drawing. Pretty good. So let's just imagine that we've got two thin shapes like that, and we've just sort of, pumped it up full of pressure. And in that one too. Okay, so there's a greater fluid pressure in there. It could be a fluid, it could be a gas, or it could be a negative pressure. It could be a vacuum, and then we have a fluid pressure on the outside. It doesn't really matter for what we're doing, but let's look at elements on there to determine what the pressures will be, and what the stress state will be for these elements. So for this one, on the cylinder, let's do the cylinder first. We're going to have one stress in this direction. This is called the hoop stress, but we'll just call this stress 1. See, it's the hoop stress because it's going to be the same in this element as it will be in, say, an element above it or an element below it. As we go along, it's going to form a hoop. Boy, I use the same color for both those. So that's our hoop stress right there. We will also have a longitudinal stress along this length. Similarly, if we're in a pressure vessel and there's no other loads applied, this is going to be constant all along here, because there's not going to be any applied load to change it. So we need two stresses to consider. There's this one and this one. So if we want to know, let's do the hoop stress first. Let's think about that one first. So if we're thinking about the hoop stress, let's first just take out a hoop. Right? Let's look at a hoop, and of course that's not going to tell us anything. But if we cut the hoop in half, so that we end up with, and oh boy, here comes drawing something. So that we've got half the hoop. The hoop's like, going like this. And then we've got, this worked out fairly well. And then, there's the back. Okay, it's a little bit, okay. Well, the perspective's a little bit silly. Okay, but this is half the hoop. So we've got, there's one more line right there. There we go. So, on this surface right here, we have the hoop stress. and also on this one right here. And if we cut this in half, like I said we would, these are in the same direction. This one. But we're also going to have pressure applied. Now the pressure, obviously we could apply it all around down here, right? Like all along there. But we could also think of it as what is needed to hold the fluid in place. So we can just form the fluid right there and say that the pressure applies to keep the fluid in place also has to be the pressure that the fluid exerts on this shell, because, well, you've got to maintain static equilibrium, of course, in the whichever direction this is. Let's call it the z direction. Yeah, let's call that the x direction, that the z direction, and that the y direction. So we've got this. This is just the pressure, because it's uniform pressure throughout. So now we can write our equilibrium equation. We can write that the summation of force in the z direction has to be 0, and that's going to be equal to, well, stress 1 times, we picked a differential length right there, or just some representative length, dx times the thickness of the shell times 2 of them, right? Because there's one up here and there's one down there, so that's one of our forces. I'm gonna say that we, cut the back end of this so that that's the positive direction, minus this pressure right here. So that's going to be the pressure inside the pressure vessel times, and then we look at this right here. This, because we cut this in half, is the radius of the pressure vessel. So that's going to be 2 times r times our distance in the x direction. And of course that has to sum to 0. We can rearrange this now. Looks like everything's just sort of, we've got 2's, we've got an r right here, dx, don't worry, we don't have to worry about integrating in this case, because those are going to divide out. We're just going to end with rearranging all of this into stress 1 equals the pressure times the radius divided by thickness. Pretty easy, huh? So that's what we have for the stress in the hoop stress, the stress in the one direction. And that, you can see, is pretty easy to obtain. It's just a function of the pressure in the vessel, the radius of the vessel, and the thickness of the vessel. And I think that presumably you're thinking that this is probably the easiest equation it could possibly have ended up being, huh? Because it's definitely going to have all these things involved in it. All right, let's move on now to the pressure, or the stress in the second direction. That is to say, the stress in the longitudinal stress of the cylinder.